What if everything you thought you knew about a powerful family was wrong? Not partially wrong, not exaggerated, but fundamentally, dangerously wrong. Because sometimes the most unsettling stories don't begin with screams, sirens, or flashing lights. Sometimes they begin in silence. In a house that looks exactly like it did the day before. In a neighborhood where nothing ever seems to happen. In a family whose name feels too familiar, too successful, too protected for something unthinkable to unfold behind closed doors. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And yet, here we are. A quiet Sunday, a private home, and a discovery that would fracture a family narrative forever. Let me ask you something directly. When headlines explode overnight, do you ever stop and wonder what was happening long before the cameras showed up? Before police statements were carefully worded? Before attorneys chose their language? Before the story hardened into something the public could consume in neat, confident sentences? Because this story did not begin the moment the news broke. It began long before that. And the reason it matters now is because something new has emerged. Something investigators didn't talk about at first. Something that reframes the entire timeline. Something that forces a much more uncomfortable question to the surface. What if the version of events everyone accepted was only the safest one to tell? In the early hours after the discovery, the language was cautious, measured, almost sterile. Officials confirmed little. Reporters repeated what they were allowed to repeat. Social media did what it always does, filling the silence with certainty. But silence, in cases like this, is never empty. It's crowded with things people aren't ready to say yet. And that's where this story really begins. Because at the center of it is a family whose public image was built on success, creativity, and longevity. A household that symbolized stability. A name that carried cultural weight. To the outside world, this was a story about achievement and legacy. To the people inside the house, it may have been something very different. Here's the contradiction that should already be bothering you. If this was a sudden, shocking act, why do so many details feel slow, deliberate, almost restrained? Why did officials emphasize some facts immediately, while carefully sidestepping others? Why did certain words appear again and again in early statements, while other obvious questions were left untouched? And why, days later, did a single phrase quietly shift the tone of everything? Special circumstances. Those two words don't appear accidentally. They are not decorative. They are not emotional. They are precise, legal, heavy. They suggest planning, or at least the possibility of it. So let's rewind. Not to the crime itself, not to the discovery, but to the moment before anyone knew anything was wrong. Imagine a house that morning. Familiar, orderly, nothing overturned, nothing visibly shattered. A place where routines had likely repeated themselves thousands of times before. Breakfast habits, unspoken expectations, old disagreements that never quite went away, but never exploded either. Because families don't usually fall apart in a single moment. They fracture slowly. Pressure builds quietly. Expectations pile up. Resentments don't announce themselves. They wait. And when something finally breaks, people always say the same thing afterward. There were no signs, no warnings, no reason to suspect anything. But that's rarely true. It's just easier to believe. When the daughter arrived that day, she wasn't expecting history to stop. She wasn't preparing to become the first witness in a case that would dominate headlines. She was stepping into what should have been an ordinary moment. And that's what makes discovery so devastating. Not just the loss, but the sudden realization that the world you thought you understood no longer exists in the same way. Authorities would later confirm that a knife was used. But even that statement was carefully constructed. Not where it came from, not where it was found, not how it factored into the sequence of events. Just that it existed. And that omission matters more than it seems. Because in investigations like this, details aren't withheld because they're unimportant. They're withheld because they're powerful. Think about it. If everything was straightforward, why not say so? If the narrative was clean, why not explain it fully? Instead, we were given fragments. Enough to shock, enough to alarm, but not enough to understand. And then came the charge. First-degree murder. With special circumstances. That's the moment when the story stopped being just tragic and started becoming something else entirely. Because those words don't describe an accident. They don't describe a sudden loss of control. They describe intent, or at the very least, the belief that intent can be proven. And when that belief exists, it means investigators are holding something back. Something they believe will speak louder in a courtroom than it ever could in a press conference. Here's another question you should be asking yourself. Why did the narrative focus so heavily on who discovered the scene, rather than how the scene came to be? Why did early coverage lean into shock and emotion, while avoiding deeper examination of timeline, access, and opportunity? And why did officials specifically mention that details about the weapon would be presented later? Later where? In court. Which tells us one thing very clearly. This is not a case built on speculation. It's a case being built like a story with chapters, and the public has only read the first page. What makes this even more unsettling is how familiar it all feels. Not the crime itself, but the structure. A respected family, a private home, a shocking turn, a suspect no one expected. A narrative that seems simple until you look at it too closely. And when you do look closely, cracks appear. Small ones at first. Timing that doesn't quite line up. Silences that feel intentional. Statements that say exactly what they need to say, and nothing more. And then there's the emotional contradiction at the heart of it all. How does a family go from normalcy to catastrophe without anyone outside noticing? The uncomfortable answer is that they don't. We just don't see what we're not invited to see. Which brings us to the most important idea of this entire story. Public image is not evidence. Familiarity is not understanding. And legacy does not protect anyone from consequence. As more information began to surface, one thing became clear. Investigators weren't scrambling. They weren't confused. They were measured. And that suggests preparation. Preparation means they saw something early that shaped everything that followed. Something that hasn't fully been explained yet. Something that reframes how we should interpret the silence, the timing, and the charge itself. So before we move forward, I want you to hold on to this thought. What if the most important evidence in this case isn't what was found, but when it was noticed? Because the moment investigators noticed, it may be the moment this case truly began. And in the next section, we're going to walk directly into the night everything ended. Not through rumor, not through speculation, but through the sequence of moments that now sit at the center of this unfolding story. Because once you understand the night, you start to understand why the morning shocked everyone. It doesn't begin with sirens. It doesn't begin with flashing lights or police tape. It begins quietly, subtly, almost imperceptibly. And that quiet is what makes the shock so much greater when it breaks. Imagine a house where every corner is familiar. Furniture perfectly arranged. Photographs capturing moments of happiness, trophies and awards lining shelves, proof of years of ambition and accomplishment. From the outside, it looked like any other upper-middle-class home in a calm neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors nod politely over fences, where people feel safe behind closed doors. But inside, something was about to unravel, a sequence of events that would fracture a family and seize the attention of the world. It was late Sunday evening when the daughter arrived home. She expected an ordinary family dinner, maybe a casual conversation about the week ahead. Maybe she expected nothing at all, just another quiet night in a house she had known all her life. She wasn't preparing to discover that life as she knew it had been shattered. She wasn't expecting to walk into a scene that would haunt every detail of her memory forever. The first thing she noticed was the stillness. Not the comforting stillness of a home at rest, but an unnatural quiet. No laughter, no music, no murmured conversation. Just silence. And silence, in situations like this, carries weight. She called out, casually at first, then with a growing sense of unease. The response was nothing. Her heart began to accelerate, but she brushed it off. Maybe everyone was in another room. Maybe they had stepped out. Maybe it was nothing. But then, a detail caught her eye. Something small but off. A chair pushed back slightly as if someone had left in a hurry. A book lying open on the floor. A framed photograph slightly askew. Nothing drastic. Nothing that screamed danger. But enough to prick the subconscious. Enough to make her pause. And then she saw it. Not the scene as the headlines would later describe it. Not the shock that would ripple through news outlets, social media, and family friends. She saw the reality first, that her parents were no longer safe. That the place she had always associated with warmth and protection had become a site of tragedy. The discovery was immediate, but the implications were complex. How had this happened? Who could have done it? The daughter's mind raced, trying to reconcile what she saw with the parents she knew, the life they had led, and the family she thought she understood. Officials would later report that a knife was used. But even that statement, while factually precise, leaves room for endless questions. Where was the weapon? How was it obtained? When was it used? Each of these questions points toward sequences and choices, toward a plan, or at least toward a sequence of actions that someone understood with chilling clarity. And therein lies the first contradiction, the first tension, a house so familiar, a family so close, and yet events unfolding with such unpredictability and precision that no one could anticipate them. Consider the environment. A quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other's routines. Where a family of prominence lived, trusted by neighbors and friends. Where private lives were carefully curated, selectively revealed only to maintain appearances. And yet, beneath this calm, there may have been a hidden turbulence, a pressure cooker of private tensions invisible to the outside world. Think about timing. In cases like this, every minute matters. Every action, every silence, every door opened or closed is part of a puzzle. And early reports hinted at inconsistencies. Small discrepancies in arrival times, in accounts of where family members had been, in seemingly trivial details that later investigators would scrutinize relentlessly. The daughter's perspective matters here. She became the first human witness, the initial observer, the one whose testimony would shape not just what authorities knew, but also how the public perceived the unfolding events. Her experience wasn't a statement or a headline. It was raw, emotional, and deeply human. She wasn't just encountering the physical scene. She was encountering the psychological shock of realizing that the world she trusted was suddenly unstable. And yet, even amidst the immediate panic, a strange clarity emerges. Investigators, as they arrived, began piecing together timelines. Every movement, every object, every minute was significant. The daughter's initial report would become a key piece in the evidentiary puzzle, a puzzle that, at the time, had only begun to form. It's also important to recognize how appearances can mislead. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. Neighbors who passed by noticed nothing unusual. Mail deliveries were made. Cars parked as usual. Yet behind the front door, a tragedy had already occurred. This contrast between perception and reality is what makes the story so compelling and so chilling. Another factor to consider is emotional context. Families, even the most accomplished or respected, live with internal pressures. Expectations, unspoken resentments, financial concerns, personal ambitions. These pressures rarely appear on the surface, but they can shape behavior, decision-making, and even the escalation of conflict. While we can't know the private dynamics in their entirety, we can observe the echoes that appear in evidence, statements, and the subtle inconsistencies in accounts. And here's a striking question for you. How often do we mistake calm for certainty? How often do we assume that a quiet household, a respected family, or a stable home guarantees safety? The answer, as this story demonstrates, is almost never. Quiet does not equal safety. Familiarity does not equal understanding. And trust, even within families, can sometimes be fragile. From a narrative perspective, the night everything ended is more than just a timeline of events. It's an illustration of how ordinary routines can intersect with extraordinary circumstances. How a single moment can shift from normality to crisis without warning. How human perception, even in the most familiar environments, can fail to anticipate danger. As investigators began their work, the first questions were deceptively simple. Who discovered the scene? Who had access to the home? What time did key events occur? And yet, these questions are loaded. Because every answer reveals a potential discrepancy, a point of tension, or a detail that might otherwise go unnoticed. In cases like this, the small details, the ones we tend to ignore in everyday life, become the foundation for understanding motive, opportunity, and sequence. The silence in the house, the initial shock of discovery, the presence of a weapon, the carefully worded statements from authorities. All of these elements converge to create a narrative that is at once compelling and unnerving. They hint at precision, planning, and consequence. They also leave room for speculation, uncertainty, and tension. which is precisely why public curiosity escalates so rapidly in these moments. And finally, the chapter closes on the tension of anticipation. The daughter's discovery is only the beginning. What happens next, in the hours and days that follow, determines not just the investigation, but the story as it will be told to the public. Every choice, from what investigators reveal, to what authorities emphasize, to how statements are framed, feeds into a larger narrative that will capture attention and provoke debate. Who would have thought that someone so familiar could become the center of a story this dark? That's the question everyone asked when news broke. Not just reporters, not just neighbors, but friends, family, colleagues, people who had known him for years. People who had grown up with him, celebrated milestones with him, trusted him as part of a household that symbolized stability. Rick Reiner. The name was simple, unassuming. The face, familiar. The public image, one of a quiet, perhaps even reserved, young man who had grown up in the shadow of a prominent family. But that's just what made the shock so complete. Because when first-degree murder with special circumstances is announced, the world instinctively looks for strangers, outsiders, unexpected threats. Rarely do we assume the suspect is the one closest to the victim. And yet, in this case, the one who had the most access, the one who lived under the same roof, was exactly the person authorities charged. It begins with contradictions. Rick was a son who appeared, from the outside, to have everything. Education, opportunity, family support, and an environment that encouraged success. Yet appearances are not the same as reality. And in families of prominence, appearances often matter more than the truth. Let's step back and consider his life. Raised in a home that demanded achievement, success, and decorum. Parents who were respected publicly, whose household seemed orderly and protected. Siblings who navigated expectations in different ways. And then, Rick himself, balancing private struggles with the image he was expected to project. That balance is tricky, because in families where legacy is a priority, personal frustrations often remain hidden, unacknowledged, or misinterpreted. But here's where the tension begins. Because when authorities name a suspect, they are not just alleging a crime. They are alleging opportunity, motive, and a sequence of events. They are asserting that, in their view, this person acted in a way that is deliberate, conscious, and with awareness of consequence. That is what first-degree murder with special circumstances implies. And yet the public reaction was disbelief. How could the son, someone who had shared meals, holidays, and family memories, be responsible? People asked, was it an accident? Was it self-defense? Was it something else entirely? The answer, as investigators would later indicate, was far more calculated than anyone initially assumed. To understand Rick in this moment, you need to understand perception versus reality. To the outside world, he was ordinary. To those closest to him, the narrative was more complicated. Quiet, withdrawn, sometimes brooding. Seen occasionally with friends, sometimes distant, occasionally frustrated. And in the silence of his room, the long hours alone, or private moments we will never fully know, decisions could have been forming, decisions no one could have anticipated. And this is where curiosity spikes, because the charges suggest not just an action, but a premeditated one. That means investigators saw a pattern, a trigger, or a combination of circumstances that convinced them he was responsible. This is not speculation, it's the language of law. First degree with special circumstances is not applied lightly. It indicates evidence that points toward intent, and intent requires planning. Here's a detail that complicates things further. Early reports suggested that Rick had been at the home at the time, but there were conflicting accounts about his movements. Witnesses placed him in different parts of the neighborhood at different times. Phones, receipts, and other traces began to emerge, and each one created a web of timelines that investigators had to untangle. From a storytelling perspective, this is where tension peaks, because suddenly, someone familiar is no longer safe in our minds. The son, the one person we instinctively associate with care, loyalty, and family, is now central to an unfolding mystery. And that contradiction drives curiosity. It keeps people watching, questioning, and trying to anticipate what comes next. Think about how this affects the family psychologically. A daughter discovering her parents, a brother accused, a family's public image shattered. Imagine the emotional layers: grief, betrayal, confusion, disbelief. The private dynamics of love, loyalty, and resentment collide violently with the public perception of a perfect household. It's not just tragedy, it's dissonance amplified to an extreme. And what about motive? That's always the hardest part to grasp, and in this chapter, it begins to surface in subtle ways. Authorities rarely disclose motive at first. It is strategically revealed during investigations and trials. But patterns suggest several possibilities: long-standing family tensions, personal frustrations, disputes over control, recognition, or perceived injustice. Any combination could contribute to a motive that is invisible to casual observers but glaringly obvious to those living it or examining evidence closely. Here's the psychological twist. People naturally assume that the suspect in a family tragedy must be an outsider, someone unknown, someone unpredictable. That assumption blinds us. It leaves us unprepared to understand that familiarity doesn't preclude danger. Sometimes, proximity amplifies opportunity and risk. The person we least suspect often has the clearest access, the deepest knowledge, and the ability to act undetected until it's too late. From an audience perspective, this is where you start to feel the tension rising. You start to ask questions. How could someone live with that kind of knowledge or capability? What signs, if any, were missed? Could this have been prevented? And what does it reveal about family dynamics and hidden pressures that outsiders never see? Then comes the layer of public perception. The media naturally gravitates toward a narrative that is both sensational and simplified. The shocked son, the grieving daughter, the tragic parents. But in reality, the narrative is far more nuanced. Evidence will tell a different story. Patterns of behavior, timelines, and forensic findings will complicate the simplistic story everyone is desperate to believe. Here's a striking fact. In cases where family members are suspects, the public is often the last to suspect what investigators see clearly from the beginning. Access, motive, opportunity, all converge, and small details, often dismissed in ordinary life, suddenly become decisive. And that's what makes the next part of this story so crucial. Because identifying the suspect isn't just about assigning blame. It's about uncovering how ordinary interactions, private frustrations, and family dynamics escalated into an event that would dominate headlines, public imagination, and courtroom proceedings. So as we leave this chapter, consider this. The person you least expect often holds the key. The quiet, familiar figure who blends seamlessly into daily life may be the one whose choices alter everything. And the revelation that would shake both family and investigators alike was still just beginning to surface. Because behind the public image of Rick Reiner lay details, decisions, and dynamics that no one had yet fully grasped. What do the words first-degree murder with special circumstances really mean? Most people hear them and feel an instinctive chill. They are legal terms, but they carry emotional weight far beyond the courtroom. They suggest calculation, deliberation, and a depth of intent that transforms a crime from tragedy into something far more complex. Something prosecutors and investigators treat with utmost seriousness. Let's break it down. First-degree murder is not impulsive. It's not accidental. It's a deliberate act carried out with awareness of its consequences. Every step, every choice, every moment leading up to the act matters. And special circumstances adds another layer. Aggravating factors that make the case exceptional, legally significant, and subject to harsher consequences. In plain language, it implies that the law sees more than just the act. It sees planning, forethought, and context that cannot be ignored. Think about how that reframes what we've learned so far. A family that appeared orderly and secure, a home that seemed calm and familiar, a son who seemed ordinary. Suddenly, all of those assumptions collide with the reality suggested by the charges. It's not just that someone died. It's that investigators believe the act was intentional, possibly premeditated, and legally extraordinary. That's a weight that changes every perspective. Now, here's an important question for you. When you hear special circumstances, what do you think of? Money? Revenge? Jealousy? Opportunity? In reality, it can include a range of factors, from the use of a deadly weapon to the nature of the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. And each factor tells a story. Each factor hints at what investigators believe. and what they are preparing to prove in court. In this case, the special circumstances are particularly chilling because of the relationships involved. The accused isn't a stranger. He isn't someone passing through. He is a family member, living under the same roof, sharing meals, routines, and a daily life that everyone assumed was normal. That proximity makes the legal and emotional stakes higher. It transforms grief into disbelief. And it transforms a tragedy into a legal drama where motive, opportunity, and intent intersect in ways few people are prepared to understand. To understand why this charge is so significant, consider what investigators need to prove. First, they must establish intent. That means demonstrating that the accused consciously decided to commit the act. It's not enough to show that someone was present or angry. There must be evidence, subtle or overt, that indicates planning or deliberate decision-making. Second, they must establish premeditation, especially under special circumstances. Premeditation doesn't require weeks of plotting, but it does require evidence that the act was thought through in advance, that choices were made with awareness of consequences. And in family cases, where emotional proximity and prior interactions are complex, demonstrating premeditation is challenging. It requires careful analysis of timelines, access, behavior, and sometimes seemingly minor details that, in isolation, appear ordinary. This is where the narrative becomes fascinating from both a legal and storytelling perspective, because as outsiders, we often miss the details that matter most. A phone call at an odd hour, a minor dispute that seems trivial, a door left unlocked. Every small element, when combined with motive, opportunity, and intent, forms a tapestry that investigators rely on to construct a case. And that leads us to the heart of the chapter, the contrast between appearance and evidence. Publicly, a family seems cohesive, a home seems secure, and a son seems harmless. Privately, timelines suggest movement, behavior suggests calculation, and investigators see patterns invisible to the casual observer. That contrast is the engine of tension. It drives curiosity and keeps people engaged, because the truth is not immediately obvious. It has to be pieced together. There's another dimension to consider, the psychology of charges. Legal language often feels cold, but it reflects the gravity of the accusation. In first-degree murder with special circumstances, investigators and prosecutors are signaling that this isn't a crime of passion, a fleeting lapse in judgment, or an unfortunate accident. It is a case where evidence points toward responsibility, forethought, and legal gravity. And that framing shapes how the public perceives both the accused and the events. From a storytelling perspective, that framing is key. It allows us to explore contradictions, motivations, and hidden tensions without assuming guilt. It allows us to ask questions. How did relationships, pressures, and choices lead to this moment? What patterns were missed? How does access intersect with opportunity? And why do certain facts emerge in early reports, while others are deliberately withheld? Because withholding information is never accidental. In cases like this, authorities choose carefully what to release publicly. They balance transparency with strategy, curiosity with legal integrity. And every omission generates speculation, sometimes accurate, sometimes misleading, but always heightens the tension. Here's an example. Early statements confirmed that a knife was used but provided no information about its location or acquisition. Why? Because these details, while seemingly minor, are critical to establishing premeditation and intent. The law recognizes that evidence, when revealed prematurely, can compromise the integrity of the case. And that's why careful language in public statements matters so much. It's a signal that something significant exists, even if it's not yet visible. And this is where the audience should start thinking critically, because understanding the gravity of the charge changes how we interpret every preceding and subsequent event. The discovery of the scene, the identity of the suspect, the emotional reactions, all of these are now framed by the legal assessment that the act may have been deliberate, intentional, and extraordinary. There's also an emotional dimension. The family must grapple not only with grief, but with the implications of the charges. The daughter, for example, is not just processing loss. She is witnessing the transformation of someone she knew intimately into a subject of extraordinary legal scrutiny. That shift complicates mourning adds layers of disbelief, and transforms the narrative from personal tragedy into a story that engages the public, the media, and legal authorities simultaneously. Another important aspect. In first-degree cases, every detail is magnified. Investigators examine routines, conversations, movements, and behaviors that might have gone unnoticed before. Small discrepancies, once trivial, now take on significance. Each item of evidence, each recollection, each interaction becomes a thread in a complex web designed to reveal intent and sequence. And that's where suspense emerges naturally. Because as outsiders, we see only fragments. We see news reports, carefully phrased statements, and headlines designed to catch attention. Investigators see timelines, motives, and patterns. The difference between what we perceive and what they know drives curiosity, speculation, and engagement. Finally, consider the emotional stakes for everyone involved. A family is torn between loyalty and justice. A community struggles to reconcile familiarity with the shock of charges. A public grapples with contradictions. The son they thought they knew, the crime they can barely comprehend, and the legal system navigating both. These tensions, emotional and psychological, set the stage for the next phase of the story. And as we close this chapter, remember this: the law does not act on emotion alone. It relies on evidence, sequence, and the ability to demonstrate intentionality. First-degree murder with special circumstances is a statement, not just of accusation, but of belief. It signals that investigators see a story beyond the obvious, a story of planning, intention, and legal significance. What's missing can matter more than what's found. In every investigation, the weapon is more than a tool. It's a key piece of the puzzle. It's evidence that can illuminate timing, sequence, and, in some cases, intent. And in this story, the knife, the single instrument at the center of the alleged crime, was already drawing intense scrutiny. But the questions surrounding it were far more complicated than most people realized. Authorities confirmed that a knife was used. That much was public. But where it came from, how it was obtained, and when it entered the home, all of these details were deliberately withheld. Hochman, speaking cautiously, hinted that these facts would eventually be presented in court. That statement alone raised eyebrows. Why not tell the public immediately? Why leave so many unknowns in an already high-profile story? The answer lies in strategy, precision, and the way the law treats evidence. Imagine the investigators in that home. Every object, every surface, every trace is a potential clue. The knife isn't just a weapon. It's a timeline, a signature, a link between suspect and action. Where it was found can indicate the movements of those involved. How it was handled can suggest intent, control, and knowledge. And what's most crucial, in special circumstances cases, is whether the weapon was chosen deliberately, premeditated, or opportunistically. Here's something the public rarely considers. Investigators often know far more than they reveal. They may have evidence in hand, but revealing it too early can compromise the case. It can allow suspects to create alternative narratives, obscure timelines, or destroy other evidence. In a situation where a family member is the accused, the stakes are even higher. Every decision, every movement, every interaction is scrutinized, and the weapon, simple, ordinary, yet deadly, becomes the centerpiece of this scrutiny. Let's step back for perspective. A knife is not unusual in any home. But in this case, it's not the existence of the knife that matters. It's its context. Was it taken from a kitchen drawer during a moment of impulse? Was it brought from somewhere else? Was it accessible to others in the household or exclusively to the accused? Each possibility tells a different story and suggests a different level of preparation and intent. And consider timing. The placement of the weapon can indicate who was where, when. Small details, like fingerprints, smudges, or positioning, can transform a seemingly minor object into a linchpin of the investigation. When authorities hint that they will reveal its location later, they're signaling that the sequence of events is crucial to understanding intent. It's not just what happened, it's when and how it happened. Forensic experts also weigh in. The knife itself can tell a story, the type of blade, its condition, whether it was cleaned, whether it shows signs of previous use. These details are subtle but powerful. They feed into the narrative of premeditation versus accident, opportunity versus impulse. Every scratch, mark, or fingerprint becomes a piece of the evidence tapestry. And yet, for the public, the narrative is incomplete. Early media reports focus on shock, emotion, and the human element. They describe the discovery, the family, the accused. But the weapon remains almost mythic in its absence. It's referenced, acknowledged, yet mysterious. And that ambiguity drives curiosity. Audiences naturally fill the gaps with speculation. Where was it found? Who handled it first? Could it have been removed or planted? Each question compounds tension, amplifies engagement, and reinforces the story's gripping nature. Another crucial point: investigators rarely disclose how or where a weapon was obtained until they are confident in the narrative they will present. In cases of special circumstances, timing is everything. Revealing a detail too soon could allow a defense attorney to argue alternative explanations or challenge the chain of custody. That's why statements like Hochman's are carefully worded. They maintain suspense, protect evidence, and signal that the most compelling facts are still to come. But there's more to this than legal strategy. There's psychology. A weapon in a home, in a family context, carries emotional weight. It's intimate, domestic, familiar. The public imagines it as part of everyday life, a kitchen knife, a utility tool. But when it is used to commit an extraordinary act, that familiarity turns eerie. It blurs the line between ordinary and catastrophic, safe and dangerous, love and betrayal. And here's the most compelling paradox. The object everyone knows exists, the knife, remains elusive in narrative significance. Its role is simultaneously obvious and mysterious. Its existence is confirmed, but its story is incomplete. And that incompleteness fuels the next stage of investigation, courtroom strategy, and public fascination. From a storytelling perspective, this is where tension peaks. Because the audience knows something critical exists, but not its full story. That knowledge gap is a classic retention tool. People are compelled to continue, to watch, to learn, because they feel they are missing the most important piece of the puzzle. And let's not forget emotional stakes. The daughter, the accused, and the broader family are all psychologically tethered to the object in ways the public cannot fully comprehend. For the daughter, the knife is not just evidence. It's a symbol of loss, confusion, and the sudden transformation of her reality. For investigators, it is a tool to reconstruct events with precision. For the public, it is the mysterious centerpiece that defines curiosity, speculation, and moral outrage. Here's another layer. Timing discrepancies related to the knife are subtle but consequential. Small inconsistencies in when it was accessed, who may have touched it, or where it was placed can shape the narrative of premeditation. Investigators will examine every angle: the domestic layout, the access to drawers or storage, the possibility of interference or absence. And each detail builds toward the broader legal argument that the act was deliberate, conscious, and extraordinary. So as we close this chapter, remember this: the knife is more than a weapon. It is evidence, timeline, motive indicator, and psychological trigger all at once. Its presence, absence, and context are critical to understanding the case, shaping the narrative, and building anticipation for what comes next. And the revelation about this weapon, the detail investigators nearly dismissed at first, would soon emerge as the element that changes how we understand the entire night. Have you ever noticed how silence can feel heavier than sound? Not the peaceful, comforting silence of a quiet evening, but the kind of silence that presses against your chest, that makes every footstep feel amplified, every breath conspicuous, every thought louder than it should be. That's the silence inside the Reiner household the night everything changed. When the daughter arrived that Sunday evening, the stillness hit her first. No laughter, no chatter, no signs of routine, not even the subtle hum of life. A ticking clock, a running appliance, the faint rustle of movement. Just an absence so profound it became almost audible. And in cases like this, silence is not passive, it's a message. It hints at what has happened, even if you are not yet ready to see it. Imagine stepping into your home expecting familiarity, comfort, and safety. Now imagine that every sensory cue, the smell of food, the familiar clutter of daily life, the subtle warmth of presence, is gone. replaced by a stillness so intense it feels like the house itself is holding its breath. That's exactly what the daughter confronted. And in that moment, the ordinary perception of home, of security, shattered. Silence, in such cases, is layered. There's the literal quiet, the absence of voices, movement, and sound. But there's also psychological silence, the absence of explanation, understanding, or context. You know something is wrong, but the specifics elude you. That tension is emotionally overwhelming. It makes ordinary details, the tilt of a chair, a drawer left slightly ajar, the positioning of objects, become evidence in your mind, even before any official investigation begins. And consider this. In many investigations, the initial discovery is critical. The first person to encounter the scene, often a family member, shapes the narrative simply by noticing the discrepancies. The daughter's experience illustrates this perfectly. She did not see the scene as a headline would later describe it. She didn't know about charges, motives, or timelines. She only saw what was immediately before her, and yet those details, seemingly mundane, would become crucial in understanding what happened, when, and how. There's a paradox in silence. On one hand, it conceals. It hides actions, intentions, and events. On the other, it reveals. It draws attention to what is missing, what is abnormal, and what cannot be explained. Every investigative step relies on noticing these absences. Investigators learn to read silence like text, understanding that what is missing can be just as important as what is present. From a psychological perspective, silence also amplifies suspicion and fear. The daughter's mind raced, trying to reconcile the emptiness she encountered with the familiarity of the home she had always known. Each second without sound or response stretched into a question. Where are they? What happened? Why is everything still? In domestic homicides, this mental tension is often the first emotional clue investigators consider. It speaks to human awareness of abnormality, perception of threat, and the cognitive leap from normalcy to crisis. And let's layer in a second complexity. The daughter had to maintain composure while processing shock. The emotional demands in these first moments are intense. She had to observe, understand, and respond while her brain attempted to process the unimaginable. That duality, acting while processing trauma, is common in first witnesses to domestic crimes, and it's critical for investigators to capture because it often determines early timelines and accounts. The silence also magnified contradictions. The house looked normal, yet the reality was devastating. That tension between appearance and truth is a recurring theme in high-profile family tragedies. To neighbors, friends, or anyone outside, the world appeared unchanged. To the daughter, the reality inside was fractured, immediate, and undeniable. This dissonance fuels the emotional weight of the story, engaging audiences because they, too, begin to feel the contrast between what they see and what they cannot yet know. Investigators would later note subtle environmental clues that emerged from the silence. A slightly ajar door, the arrangement of furniture, the undisturbed position of everyday objects, small indicators that, when interpreted in sequence, help reconstruct the events. And yet, at the moment of discovery, these were imperceptible to anyone untrained. The daughter only felt a generalized unease, a sense that something had irrevocably changed. This is where narrative tension escalates. Silence becomes a canvas for imagination, speculation, and emotional engagement. Audiences are drawn into the story because they, like the daughter, can sense that something is off. But unlike the daughter, they rely on narrative, media, and later investigative revelations to fill in the blanks. This interplay between observed and unknown is the engine that drives retention in stories like this. And consider the timing. Silence stretched across minutes, hours, and days. Until authorities arrived, until evidence was collected, and until the narrative began to solidify. Each period of stillness became a reference point. Investigators would later map these periods against timelines, access, and opportunity to establish sequences of action, reactions, and omissions. In essence, silence itself becomes evidence. There's also an emotional irony here. Homes are usually places of comfort and voice, of expression and interaction. But when tragedy occurs, that same space becomes a repository of absence. The familiar walls hold not warmth, but tension. Objects that once symbolized normalcy now serve as reminders of loss. And the people left behind must navigate both the shock of what they see and the interpretation of what remains silent. For the daughter, that night was a series of mental leaps. From disbelief to shock, from shock to cautious observation, and from observation to an unspoken realization. Life as she knew it had ended, and she was at the center of a story that would unfold far beyond the house, far beyond the neighborhood, and far beyond the family itself. So as this chapter closes, remember, silence is never empty. It is a signal, a clue, a weight. It is both emotional and evidential. And in this story, it would carry implications that no one, family, investigators, or the public, was fully prepared for. How do you make sense of chaos? One moment, life is ordinary. The next, everything has changed. In cases like this, the timeline becomes everything. It's the spine of the investigation, the framework that separates speculation from fact, the method by which investigators reconstruct events that no one expected to occur. Sunday began like any other day in Brentwood. The neighborhood was quiet, as Sundays often are. Birds chirped in the morning sun. Joggers traced familiar paths. And inside the Reiner household, life unfolded in a rhythm that, from the outside, appeared mundane. Breakfast, conversations, departures and arrivals. But as anyone who studies high-profile domestic tragedies knows, it's in the ordinary that the extraordinary often lurks. The daughter's movements, as later reconstructed, provide the first anchor in this timeline. She left the house in the morning for errands. She returned around late afternoon, expecting the typical calm of family life. But nothing could have prepared her for the scene she would encounter. Investigators quickly worked backward. They examined phone records, security footage from nearby streets, receipts, and witness statements. Each piece was a timestamp, a clue, a confirmation, or contradiction of prior assumptions. And as they began to assemble the sequence, a disturbing pattern emerged. Access, movement, and interaction all pointed toward a narrow window during which the tragedy occurred. By all accounts, the parents had spent part of the day engaged in routine activities, calls, personal projects, and small errands. Nothing outwardly abnormal. But minor details later came under scrutiny. A misplaced object, a locked drawer, a faint scent, a noise that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but would later help corroborate timelines. Investigators began to see the day not as one continuous flow, but as a series of intersecting moments. Moments that, when examined closely, revealed opportunity, preparation, and motive. The presence of the son at certain points in the day became pivotal. Early reports suggested he had been seen in different areas of the neighborhood at overlapping times. These discrepancies required careful cross-checking. Investigators began mapping cell phone pings, vehicle movements, and witness accounts to narrow down the exact periods when he could have accessed the home undetected. This is where precision matters most in first-degree murder cases. The difference of a few minutes can validate or challenge premeditation claims. And then there was the element of discovery. The daughter's return to the home marks a critical moment in the timeline. It is not just about when she arrived. It is about what she noticed, what she interpreted, and how those initial observations influenced the reconstruction of events. Investigators rely heavily on first impressions because they often reveal both human perception and factual evidence simultaneously. Consider the weapon, revisited in the timeline. Its positioning, use, and potential movement are all tied to precise timing. When it was accessed relative to the movements of household members becomes crucial to establishing intent. Did the act occur in a moment of opportunity, or was there deliberate selection of the instrument? Each scenario tells a different story, and each scenario impacts both legal strategy and narrative interpretation. Psychologically, timelines also matter because they reveal human behavior under pressure. How did each person react when confronted with unusual circumstances? Who noticed discrepancies? Who acted? These questions are vital because they form the basis for understanding decision-making in moments of extreme stress. And the timeline allows investigators to match behavior with evidence, forming a sequence that is as much about psychology as it is about law. Now let's layer in external factors. Neighbors, passersby, and anyone near the home contribute to the timeline. Even seemingly trivial observations, a car leaving the driveway, a delivery made, a dog barking, can help validate or challenge sequences of action. In high-profile cases, investigators leave no stone unturned. Every detail, no matter how small, can influence how events are interpreted in court and by the public. Here's a crucial aspect of this timeline. It reveals contradictions. Early witness statements often conflict. Times of departure and return don't always align. Security camera footage may be incomplete. Phone logs may show anomalies. Investigators must reconcile these discrepancies because timelines in cases like this are not just about sequence. They are about credibility, motive, and intent. From a storytelling perspective, the timeline is a narrative device that maintains suspense. Audiences follow the sequence because it allows them to piece together events alongside investigators. Each revealed detail becomes a clue. Each small contradiction creates tension, and each newly discovered fact forces a reassessment of what was assumed earlier. Consider the emotional dimension as well. For the daughter and family members, living the timeline in reverse, piece by piece, is psychologically wrenching. They must reconcile ordinary moments with extraordinary tragedy. They must navigate grief while trying to comprehend choices made by someone they thought they knew. This intersection of evidence and emotion is what makes domestic homicide narratives so compelling and so haunting. And finally, the timeline exposes opportunity. In cases where a suspect is a family member, timing matters enormously. The closer the relationship, the greater the access, the narrower the investigative window, and the sharper the focus on premeditation. Investigators can, in essence, reconstruct a day as a series of opportunities, moments when actions could have been taken, choices made, and consequences realized. So as this chapter closes, the timeline itself becomes more than a sequence of events. It is a framework of understanding, a map of human behavior, and a device that increases suspense. It frames the questions we all want answered. How did it happen? When? Why? And who, ultimately, was responsible? What is it like to walk into a home and immediately realize that nothing will ever be the same? For the Reiner family, the daughter's perspective is the lens through which we begin to understand the human impact of a tragedy that, on the surface, seems almost unimaginable. She didn't discover the story through news reports or social media. She discovered it firsthand, her reality crashing down around her in a single moment. And in her eyes, the ordinary household transformed into a crime scene. When she first entered the house that Sunday, the familiar smells, sounds, and routines were gone. What remained was silence, stillness, and a subtle, pervasive tension that hinted at what had occurred. The ordinary became extraordinary, safe spaces turned threatening, and every object, once mundane, suddenly became a clue. Her initial reaction was disbelief. She called out, expecting answers, reassurance, normalcy. But the lack of response amplified uncertainty. Silence became deafening, and each passing second was a psychological minefield. She could feel her heartbeat, her thoughts racing as she tried to reconcile the familiar with the horrifying. In that moment, the mind attempts to protect itself by disbelieving, rationalizing, or compartmentalizing reality. But rational thought can only go so far when confronted with evidence of sudden violence. From an investigative standpoint, the daughter's observations were critical. Investigators would later rely on her recollections to piece together timelines, potential interactions, and behavioral patterns. Even seemingly minor details she noticed, like the position of a chair, the placement of personal items, or the lack of sound in a typically busy household, served as data points in the reconstruction of events. Emotionally, she was caught between grief and disbelief. The parents she had known her entire life were gone in a moment, yet their absence carried both physical and emotional weight. She was the first human witness, the one whose testimony would become essential. And yet, even as investigators relied on her account, she was processing trauma in real time. Grief, shock, confusion, and fear all simultaneously pressing down. Imagine the paradox of understanding while being overwhelmed. The daughter needed to interpret what she saw, because her observations mattered legally and practically, but the emotional gravity of the scene threatened to overwhelm any logical thinking. It's a psychological balancing act that few are trained for, but which becomes inevitable in sudden domestic tragedies. Her perspective also highlights an uncomfortable truth. In crimes where the suspect is a family member, the lines between intimacy, trust, and betrayal blur dramatically. The daughter knew the accused as a sibling. She grew up alongside him, shared meals, holidays, and ordinary routines. And yet, the legal reality suggested that someone she trusted, someone she was close to, was responsible for an act of extraordinary violence. That cognitive dissonance, trust versus legal implication, heightens emotional stakes and public fascination alike. Furthermore, her perspective introduces a human element often absent in cold facts. Beyond the knife, timelines, and forensic evidence, there are the subtleties of human perception, how the silence felt, how the ordinary details shifted in meaning, how fear and shock colored every observation. These elements are impossible to quantify, but critical for understanding the emotional dimensions of a crime. From a narrative perspective, the daughter's experience also functions as a bridge between audience and events. Through her eyes, the public begins to connect emotionally with what happened, rather than merely consuming statistics or headlines. Audiences engage with her fear, her confusion, and her attempts to process an unimaginable situation. They empathize, question, and anticipate alongside her. Another layer, the daughter's perspective underscores the challenge of memory under trauma. Human memory is selective, malleable, and influenced by emotion. Investigators often have to cross-check initial recollections with physical evidence to ensure accuracy. Every subtle shift in timing, positioning, or description can either confirm or challenge hypotheses about what occurred. In high-stakes cases, the first witness's perspective is invaluable but requires careful interpretation. There's also a broader psychological lesson here. We often assume proximity equals awareness. That family members know one another so well that they would immediately notice abnormal behavior. But this assumption is flawed. Emotional bonds, routines, and familiarity can create blind spots. It's entirely possible for subtle warning signs to be overlooked until the point of crisis, which is precisely what makes the daughter's observations both powerful and tragic. The daughter also had to manage practical realities. Emergency services were contacted. Investigators arrived. Evidence had to be preserved. She had to navigate grief, cooperation, and practical action simultaneously. That dual responsibility, the human and the procedural, is a common but underappreciated aspect of first witness experience in domestic homicide cases. And in this particular case, her perspective would later serve as a pivot point for public understanding. Through her account, timelines were reconstructed, behavioral patterns analyzed, and the first framework of investigation established. Without her observations, the case would have lacked the critical human insight necessary to interpret sequences of events accurately. So as this chapter closes, remember the duality of her perspective: raw emotion intertwined with practical observation, disbelief interwoven with acute awareness, grief meshed with legal significance. It is a lens that reveals both the human cost and the investigative framework of this tragedy. For the Reiner household, Sunday evening transformed from tragedy to investigation the instant law enforcement arrived. It wasn't just about the parents, the accused, or the daughter. It was about the house, the objects, the layout, and every subtle clue that could reveal what had transpired in those final hours. Every crime scene has a story, and investigators are trained to read it like a book. Every page, every margin, every footnote. From the outside, the house appeared untouched, as if life had simply paused. But inside, investigators immediately recognized the signs of disruption. The arrangement of furniture, subtle marks on surfaces, and, most critically, the scene of the tragedy itself. In cases of domestic homicide, first impressions matter enormously. They guide initial evidence collection, preserve timelines, and establish the framework for forensic analysis. Authorities first had to secure the scene. That meant controlling access, preventing contamination, and beginning the meticulous process of observation. Every step mattered. In high-profile cases, the presence of family members, neighbors, or media can unintentionally compromise evidence. Investigators must balance empathy with rigor, acknowledging trauma while ensuring legal integrity. One of the first tasks was documenting the environment. Photographs, sketches, and notes were taken to capture the scene exactly as it existed upon arrival. This process is not ceremonial, it is critical. In court, photographs and detailed records allowed jurors, judges, and attorneys to understand what investigators encountered, even long after the scene has been cleared. Every angle, every shadow, every detail is part of the factual record. And then there's the emotional layer. Investigators aren't just analyzing objects. They are observing human behavior, reactions, and interactions. The daughter, still in shock, provided immediate observations. Her recollections were essential, but they also introduced a layer of tension. Investigators had to separate perception from reality, emotion from fact, while maintaining sensitivity to her trauma. It's a delicate balance that requires both technical expertise and emotional intelligence. The weapon, previously discussed in hushed terms, became a focal point. Investigators examined its location, positioning, and any forensic evidence, fingerprints, blood spatter, or residues, that could tie the sequence of actions together. In domestic cases, the way a weapon is handled often reveals intent. Was it placed deliberately, used opportunistically, or moved afterward? Every variable informs the narrative investigators will eventually present in court. Another critical component was movement reconstruction. Investigators began tracing who had been where, when, and for how long. Entry points, exits, and potential obstacles were mapped meticulously. In high-profile cases, small discrepancies can have massive consequences, influencing charges, defense strategies, and ultimately, public perception. And let's not overlook psychological profiling. Investigators often begin forming early theories about behavior, motive, and intent at the scene. While these are preliminary and subject to verification, observing family dynamics, reactions, and interactions provides critical context.